Hello and welcome. As the United States tries to draw down on the Iraq War, many analysts and scholars are now asking what lessons has America learned from the 6-year conflict, and how much have we learned about the decision-making process that led to the war. Today we speak with a top insider who was in the unique position of being involved in both Operation Desert Storm in 1991 and the 2003 invasion known as Operation Iraqi Freedom. Ambassador Richard Haass was a special assistant to President George H.W. Bush, that's the elder Bush, and a senior director in the National Security Council. Later, in the administration of George W. Bush, he was a principal advisor to Secretary of State Colin Powell. He left the administration shortly after the launch of the war to become the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, one of America's most influential and prestigious think tanks. Dr. Haass's new book is War of Necessity, War of Choice, a memoir of 2 Iraq wars. He joins us today from New York. And remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. Log on to livestation.com/AJE, enter the chat room, and then take part. We'll, of course, also welcome your phone calls on the show. Dr. Haass, welcome to the show. Let me ask you straight off the bat. In your book, you're very critical of the Bush administration and its decision to go to war. I'm talking about the younger Bush and the second war. When you look at what's happened over the last 6 years and the way this war has turned out, is your book a sort of a way of telling your former employer, I told you so?
No, the costs have been too great to derive any pleasure or any I told you so sort of mentality. Rather, it's what I wanted to do was give people a better sense of why it was things turned out the way they did. This was, as I described it, a war of choice. It wasn't inevitable. History is always shaped by people and ideas, and this was no exception. And also, anytime a country goes through the sort of experience the United States went through in Iraq, we had better learn from it. There had better be lessons. So my goal here was to make decision-making more transparent and to hopefully produce some useful lessons for the present and future.
Why do you believe that the first war was a war of necessity and the second a war of choice, a very bad and disastrous choice, as you point out in the book?
Well, the first war, which came after Saddam Hussein's invasion and occupation of Kuwait, I believe was a war of necessity because the interests involved were vital, and secondly, because there were no viable alternatives that remained other than using military force. The United States had tried diplomacy, it had tried sanctions and so forth, so by then it was either using force to liberate an occupied Kuwait or having Kuwait become permanently a part of Iraq, which would have given Saddam Hussein control over 20% of the world's oil and would have put him in a position to dominate and intimidate all the other countries in the region. The second Iraq war, launched by George W. Bush, the 43rd President of the United States, I argue and believe is a war of choice, was a war of choice. Nothing new was particularly done by Saddam at the time, which made it essential that the United States act then. And I thought the United States did have, in fact, some viable alternatives, including a much greater effort to increase the efficiency and effectiveness of the international sanctions regime that was in place at the time.
I just want to go back to something that the Vice President, Dick Cheney, said at the time. This was in January 2007, and this is in relation to what you've just been talking about it being a war of choice. He said, what we did in Iraq in taking down Saddam Hussein was exactly the right thing to do. The world is much safer today because of it. There have been 3 national elections in Iraq. There's a democracy established there, a constitution, a new democratically elected government. So he's portraying, I suppose that in some ways is a justification for going to war, and he's portraying this as a war of necessity.
Well, it was not a war of necessity, even if you believe, like Dick Cheney did, that it was a good choice. I'm not going to sit here and say nothing good was accomplished. I think the fact that Saddam Hussein is no longer in power is a good thing. And one can see several things that have happened inside Iraq which are admirable. My argument is simply that on balance, the negatives far outweigh the positive. 4 or 5 million people within Iraq have lost their homes. Iran has emerged as in many ways one of the most powerful countries in this part of the world. The United States lost more than 4,000 soldiers. This war cost upwards of $1 trillion. So again, my argument is not that nothing good came of it. It's rather that the negatives far outweighed the positives. So again, that one was a choice, and two, in my view, it was an ill-advised choice.
What about those who say it was not the rationale to go to war, but the execution of the war? Do you buy that?
There's something to that, though again, it was still a discretionary war. But obviously, if some important things had been done differently, if the United States had fought the war with a far larger number of soldiers, if we had fought it with greater international support, if afterwards the United States had not disbanded the Iraqi army or done more to put it together, if the de-Baathification efforts had not been as broad, if all of these things had been done better, I believe the costs would have been brought down. Conceivably, the benefits would have been increased, but that doesn't change the fact it still would have been a war of choice. And in my view, it still would have been an expensive war of choice because given the nature of Iraqi society, I believe there was no cheap or easy way to go about this, no matter how intelligently it was designed and executed.
You write in your book that there were two very different kinds of foreign policies that drove these decisions to go to war. You were involved in both administrations, the administration of the elder George Bush and the younger George Bush. How were these foreign policies different?
It's an important question. The foreign policies were different in concept, and they were different in how things were decided. In concept, the first Bush administration, that of George Herbert Walker Bush, was a much more traditional American foreign policy. The word often used is realist. It didn't seek to affect. Sorry, I keep losing my earpiece. It didn't seek to affect so much the internal situation in Iraq, but rather tried to bring about simply the liberation of Kuwait and to ultimately affect Iraqi foreign policy. That was its principal goal. And the way the decisions were made, I thought, were quite deliberate, were quite careful and disciplined. The second Bush administration, by contrast, had a much more ambitious approach to foreign policy. It sought to affect the internal makings of Iraq. It sought to bring democracy to Iraq. It hoped that by transforming Iraq, it would lead to democracy all around the Middle East. And also in the way the policy was made, it was far less deliberate. It was a far less rigorous, disciplined approach to making foreign policy.
Okay, Ambassador, let's go to our viewers. We've got a call on the line now from Holland. This is David in Holland. David, go ahead with your question for the Ambassador.
Hello.
David, go ahead.
Hello. Hi, good evening.
Hello.
We want to ask you something. Isn't this what they call this promised land? Isn't that Iraq, it's part of the promised land to the choosing people?
I don't see any connection between the wars, either war in Iraq and Israel or the Palestinian areas. What brought about the first Iraq war was simply a desire not to allow Saddam Hussein to take over territory by force, not to allow Iraq and Saddam Hussein to dominate the region's energy, and also, if you recall, in 1990, not to have the beginning of the post-Cold War era characterized or defined by this sort of aggression. The second Iraq war, even though, again, I opposed it, was, again, not about Israel, was not about the Palestinian people. Instead, it was all about, I believe, trying to bring democracy to Iraq, trying to bring democracy to the Middle East, dealing with weapons of mass destruction that Saddam Hussein was believed to possess.
Ambassador, when you first started expressing your misgivings about going to war, that's the second war, you made those misgivings known to Dr. Rice, Dr. Condoleezza Rice at the time. What was her response to that?
Yeah, this was in the summer of 2002, so now we're talking about 9 months before the war actually began. It was during one of my regular meetings with Dr. Rice in her office in the West Wing at the White House. And I raised the fact that many of the people who worked for me at the time were reporting to me that they were picking up signals that planning for a war in Iraq was beginning to gain momentum, and indeed they thought that it was quite possible that a decision might have already been made to actually go ahead with such a war. I didn't know, but I said I would bring it up with Dr. Rice. And I did, and she essentially cut me off and said, effectively to save my breath, that the president had already determined that a war would be necessary in order to oust Saddam Hussein from power. And again, I was quite surprised that such a decision had been made this early. I was quite surprised that the decision of this impact and magnitude would have been made without the sort of formal deliberations that I believed were warranted.
And when you look at this in retrospect, were you able to establish when that decision was taken? Because we've heard various dates. We've heard one date that takes it all the way back to the campaign for the 2000 election. Do you know when the decision was taken by the president?
Well, it clearly wasn't taken then, and I believe that 9/11 had a lot to do with it, that changed the outlook and the thinking of the president and the entire administration. I don't believe, though, a formal decision was probably taken until sometime in 2002, whether it was taken in the spring or summer. Actually, formal is not quite right. Let me restate that. I don't believe a de facto decision was made until that time. The actual decision to launch the war was not made essentially until 2003. But my own sense is the president passed what you might call the political and intellectual and psychological Rubicon, probably somewhere in the spring or summer of 2002.
Okay, Ambassador, we have to take a break right now. We'll have more of our discussion with Dr. Haass in a moment. And as we pause, let me remind you that you can join the conversation with your questions and comments by logging on to livestation.com and entering the chat room. You can see the debate taking place there right now. We'll be right back.